part. Okay. So Monsignor Frank Lane was ordained March 11th, coming up on Tuesday, his anniversary, in 1967. He's a priest of the Diocese of Columbus. He's a prelate of honor, Monsignor. A prelate of honor, created a prelate of honor by Pope John Paul II, now of course Blessed Pope John Paul II, and soon to be Saint John Paul II. There are not many people can say they were made Monsignors by a saint, but we have one here. All right? We're very happy to have him. He's probably the last one to be made a Monsignor by a saint, seeing as Pope Francis has got rid of Monsignors. So. The rest of us will just have to aim for saint. He's a graduate of the University of Innsbruck, graduating in 1967, and a graduate of the Ohio State University 1973. Monsignor has been a pastor and also a professor at a number of different colleges and universities, St. Bonaventure in New York, Ohio State, Kenyon College, and the Pontifical College Josephinum. He was also the vice rector at the Pontifical College Josephinum. He's been here at Mount St. Mary's, the Athenaeum, as spiritual director since 2010, and he's one of the special advisors to the rector, which is me. So, how fortunate can you be? So it's my distinct honor to introduce Monsignor Frank Lane.
Since the topic is secularism, it might seem out of place, but let's begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I want to thank all of you for being here this evening, and I want to thank Father Benedict for giving me the privilege to do this. It's a subject that has kind of a compelling grasp on the modern age and Western culture. And my own interest in it began a long time ago. When I was studying at the University of Innsbruck, I picked up a book which was new at the time. Now it's pretty old. And it was by an Estonian Marxist who had moved to France, converted to Catholicism, became a Catholic priest and a psychiatrist. And his name was Ignaz Leff. And at the time, and the title of the book is Atheism. At the time that Father Leff wrote this book, atheism was kind of just a peculiar little thing that belonged behind the Iron Curtain somewhere. The whole idea of an atheistic presence in Western society was not really accepted, kind of comic relief with people like Madeleine Murray O'Hare and some of the others, but never seemed to be kind of a menacing or a threatening presence. But it was of interest to me because I had, as a young person, known some and wondered what this was all about. Interestingly enough, what Leff did that entered into my mind and my memory was he didn't take on atheism as a theory. He took it on as a pathology. And he analyzed case studies in his book concerning the causes of atheism. And he attributed those causes of atheism, in a sense, to different kinds of emotional, psychological experiences. So it moved us away from any kind of theoretical understanding of atheism to kind of understanding it as a form of pathology. It's really fascinating because just 2 weeks ago there was a headline. And the headline said that there is a greater incidence of atheism in homes without fathers. That's all the study said. There was a great deal, of course, resistance to that, anger about that, all that kind of thing. for whatever reason, because there always is about everything, I guess. But it kind of reinforced to me this idea that there's human conditions and psychological situations that enter into this. The second thing that made me interested in this topic was when I was at Kenyon College. There was a young man there who was just starting out in the advancement department, and he would love to read and so forth. He came to Mass that I had, and he asked me, he said, "Now, have you read Umberto Eco's book, The Name of the Rose?" And I said, "Yes, I have read it. I found it fascinating." And he said, "Well, he has a new one out called Foucault's Pendulum." He said, "If I read it, would you read it so we can talk about it?" I said, "Sure." But I didn't realize it was 1,200 pages long. So I started, and I was on page 112 before I thought, this is the most boring thing I've ever read. I'm not going to go any further. But, well, maybe a few more pages. And then I kind of got into it, and I finished it. I don't know, have any of you ever read that, Foucault's Pendulum? It's ponderous. But the interesting thing to me was, eventually, I began to see kind of a general idea, a thesis come out of it. What it was, Umberto Eco said, what I think he was saying was that every person has a moment of fulfillment and completion in their life. After that, this is Eco saying this, after that, their life has no meaning. So they have to construct a meaning. And the way that he showed that and did that was he took the old Masonic legend, and it became just this fascinating, someone who tried to do it, who was less intelligent and with less skill, was Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code. But if you really want to know the Masonic legend, read Foucault's Pendulum, because he mines it completely in a very fascinating and interesting sort of way. But what it said was this, that when life has no meaning, we must create meaning. We must therefore delve into a mythology that bestows meaning upon our existence. Foucault's Pendulum and Ignace Leck got me kind of started thinking about this a very long time ago. The first use of the word secularism as a definition was used by George Holyoake in 1851, who defined it as promoting a social order separate from religion, which we see today. But I've broken down, there's 3 talks, and I thought, well, how can I give 3 separate talks when it's all the same idea? So I broke it down. And the first one, I said, the topic is humanity seeks to know the gods. The second topic is humanity seeks to overthrow the gods. And the third topic is humanity seeks to live without the gods. So that I think that there is a long progression in human history, and especially one associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition, that has tremendous conflict all the way through history, beginning in the earliest of days, trying to understand who this God is. There is in every single human person's life sometime the question of who am I? And in that question, and we usually associate that with the adolescence, but that's not really true. That's a question that travels with us probably throughout our lives. Those who want to expand that question of who am I into the question of what does this all mean, encounter some very difficult and primordial fundamental concepts. It seems to me that as a starting point for the quest for meaning, where do we start? If you want to say, for instance, in Foucault's Pendulum, where do you start? You start with an existing phenomenon, a Masonic legend, that goes all the way back to Solomon's Temple. The legend takes you back there, and then follows you all the way through. And like I said, Dan Brown did a pretty cheesy job following it. But Eco does a great job, if you want to know what it really is. It seems that in the beginning, whenever this is, there must be a given. There has to be a given. We can't start from nowhere in this reflection upon life's meaning, the meaning of the cosmos, the meaning of the world. We can't just say, well, I'm going to take it all in my mind and see what sips out of it. There has to be a given. And so, if that is the case, what is the given in this reflection? If we go into contemporary philosophy, and there's certainly some people better in that than I am in the room, but if we go into that, we come to understand that there's a fundamental problem in deciding what is the given. For centuries, people said, well, the given is being itself. And that how in the world do you approach being itself? That struggle has gone on from before Socrates into the 13th century and into the 21st century. Colonel Ratzinger's theology proposes something that's very interesting. It is consistent with the proposal of Bonaventure in the 13th century, and probably in other instances as well. We have been warned in contemporary philosophy that the search for being itself is futile. That the more you try to encapsulate it within rational concepts, the more it disappears. Because every time we apply human language and human reason to infinite being, it becomes less than infinite, is the argument. Ratzinger tends to agree with that. But instead of saying, well, therefore we cannot know anything, he proposes we can know being insofar as being reveals itself to us. What being gives us to know, we can know. What it is in itself, we cannot know. What is being's self-revelation to us? It is, for us, revelation itself. It is the Scriptures. It is the Holy Spirit. It is the inspiration of the Bible. It is the existence of the apostolic witness. It is the tradition of the church. That's our given. Ratzinger challenges anyone to find another given that they have not created themselves. We receive being's communication. But with that, we can reason through that revelation of being to all sorts of understandings, but we can never apply that reason to the infinite being itself. This became part of the problem with neo-scholasticism in the 19th century. God had become encapsulated in the human rational concepts and therefore could no longer be who he was. It was, to a certain extent, a challenge that had gone on through the 19th century and probably was articulated best by Heidegger in being's desire to, or being's receding, hiding itself because humanity's concepts were so inadequate. The acceptance, therefore, of authority or revelation as the given in the quest for being and meaning becomes very crucial and very critical for us. This means, in a certain sense, that there is fundamentally at the very core of the quest for meaning and the understanding of being, there is in the very core of that a surrender, a humility, something that means we accept what is given. Now we can apply all rationality to that acceptance of the given, but there must be something given. German word es gibt. There's something there that we have to assent to in some way. And in the Christian tradition, in our tradition, that given is revelation. There's a great debate in the Middle Ages about this. There's a great debate, And it comes forth in the argument between St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas on the notion of the eternity of the world. And it is a very telling argument. It's a very profound argument. It actually is published, and it's an interesting argument. Because basically, Bonaventure's argument is that if you know the world is not eternal, how can you possibly argue reasonably that it is? Thomas's response, and they received their doctorates together on the 23rd of October, 1257. They were comrades in arms with the defense of the mendicants of the University of Paris and so forth. So it's not to say they're at loggerheads with each other, they can't stand each other, or anything like that. But they disagree. Thomas says you have to begin with reason. And he says, rationally, you cannot deny the eternity of the world. It's a reasonable proposition. Bonaventure says, no, it's not a reasonable proposition because you know it's not true before you start reasoning to it. And so the two of them, therefore, apply their methodologies to this very, very significant issue. And eventually, of course, they both end up in the same place because they're both believers and they're both ultimately doctors of the church. But it's interesting to know that there is a conflict and a tension in process and in method, because we should have room for that conflict in method within our own community. But in a sense, Bonaventure is hard to refute in this particular sense, because since we cannot know being itself, he relies on being self-communication to us, and applies his rational tools to the authority of that which being has revealed to us. We both say then, we all say, there must be a given. Believer and unbeliever alike say there must be a given. But if faith is the self-communication of being itself, of God, then we have to presume that that is the most reliable foundation of our rational reflection. And that the alternative to that is what we call myth. Now, myth is not, this is something that unfortunately happened in the catechetical industry back when the big transition began to take place in the early 70s and late 60s. That all these sorts of Adam and Eve, that's a myth, blah, 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 that's a myth. What it all meant was, it's a fairy tale, and you don't have to believe it, which isn't true, because it's not a fairy tale. And we do have to, in some sense, accept it as a given, as part of the given, part of the self-communication of being, explaining not only being self, but us to ourselves as well. The alternative to that is what we call myth. If being itself is unattainable by human reason and does not reveal itself, meaning is left to the human imagination and to human reason. In that sense, Umberto Eco stands there. Since there is no meaning except my moment of personal fulfillment, therefore I must create one. And it took him 1,000 pages to tell us what it was. But it was interesting along the way. Revelation's task, though, if it encounters myth, because all humanity creates myths. Our life has a mythological foundation to it. What does being self-communication, what does God's revelation do with myth? It must inform the myth, and it must translate the myth in such a way that it becomes part of the truth of human meaning and of the meaning of our world. Myth left to itself is always in history. It's always a historical phenomenon. And it is a word about the foundations of human existence. It comes, however, from within through a certain speculation that creates a mythology. It is finally always non-historical. That means it's not ever really true. It is akin to the Babylonian myth of the Enuma Elish, for Genesis moves inside of that myth and brings out of it an awareness and a knowledge of true meaning. We're going to take a look at that for a minute. Maybe some of you have heard this before. But essentially, in the myth, in the Babylonian creation myth, there is an array of gods. This isn't going to sit well in the modern world, but the most wicked of them all was Mumu Tiamat, the saltwater sea, who was the feminine principle of creation. The more passive character was Apsu, who was the sweet water, who was the freshwater sea. They had children, and the children were disobedient, and the children were disrespectful. And so Mumu Tiamat said, well, we'll just kill them all. That would be the way to go, kind of like, a modern nihilistic secular approach. But the young gods were not about to be destroyed. And so they organized an army, and it's a great drama. It's a great story to read it even. But in the end, what happens is the god Kingu, the leader of Mumu Tiamat's army, is slain and is cut in half. Or Mumu Tiamat is cut in half. The blood of the slain god is mixed with the earth, blood and earth, dirt and the blood of a god, and humanity is created. Then Mumu Tiamat is split in half. The bottom part becomes the earth, the top part becomes the dome. Humanity, which is part dirt and part God, lives in a world of constant threat from the raging saltwater sea, from primordial chaos, from all of that. The god Marduk, who is born into this dome, is charged with defending it. He is constantly at war, lest Mumu Tiamat come rushing back through the holes in the dome and annihilate humanity. This is the myth that the Hebrews lived with when they were in Babylon. This was modern science. It had been created from the mind of humanity, knowing somehow or other these fundamental primordial concepts of the nature of the human person, partly divine and partly bad. The Hebrews, because the Jews were converting and they were entering into this pagan world, the priestly class says, they don't know our story. We must tell them our story. And their story is the first chapter of Genesis. We can go through that piece by piece, and we can take it in modern scriptural interpretation, or we can go through the medievals in it. But one thing becomes clear in this, and that is that they accept some of the structure of the contemporary mythology, but they transform it through the revelation that has been part of their oral tradition. God no longer does battle to create the world. It is done peacefully, and it is done simply with the speaking of a word. The word that he speaks initially is light, and light becomes the foundation of the created order. And then he goes through and he creates each thing. And each thing that he creates, he sees that it is good. And then, ultimately, he creates man, male and female. He creates it. And he creates him in the image and in the likeness of the divine. That's the Hebrew creation story. Compare that with the violent and the turbulent story of the Enuma Elish. Is there a similarity between them? Yes, because he creates the dome, he creates the waters, he does all these things that happen in the Enuma Elish. but it's done totally different. The God that emerges from Genesis is an all-powerful, kind, and loving creator who is all good. Totally different. Revelation informed a myth and transformed the myth into a truth that was founded not on human reason, but on being's self-communication, God's revelation to his people. Now, when this happens, and we can go back and take Genesis apart also, especially the first couple lines where the medievals saw the revelation of the Trinity, and therefore placed the Trinity at the foundation of all reality. In the beginning was God, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, God spoke the word. It was very clear to them what that was. That was not part of the Jewish understanding at the time. But that doesn't mean that revelation is able to be totally comprehended at any given time. That's what we had Bishop Abraki speaking here, and someone said something about, well, isn't this the way we develop doctrine, by dissenting? And the answer to that, of course, is no, that's not how we develop doctrine. We develop doctrine by the life of God within revelation, expanding our understanding and our comprehension of what has been given. And that becomes a process probably that will go on until the end of the world, because we still believe that the world will end. The question is then, where does this inner mythology come from? Why do the great myths seem to have some kind of parallel identity with Revelation itself? What the 19th century is going to say, of course, is that Revelation itself is the myth. But we're not there yet. What happened? I read a book not too long ago on called the Jesuit Relations. It was the letters that the North American martyrs had sent back to Paris during their mission trips among the Hurons and the Iroquois and so forth. And they were relating creation stories back to their superiors in Paris that were strikingly similar to a great deal. There is a virgin birth, there is all this kind of stuff in this mythology that the early Native Americans had. Is there a commonality in humanity that allows us to approach truth without actually grasping it through encountering revelation? There's two things. The first is we go back to Genesis. We go back to this idea of in the image and the likeness of the divine. Can any of you find in the Old Testament a time when the word image is a positive thing? Now, I don't think you can, actually. If you do, you will surprise me. It wouldn't be all bad. But that's still, image is always bad. Why is it always bad? Why was the golden calf bad? It wasn't because God was insulted that they thought he looked like a calf. It was that they thought he was one. There is no abstraction in the early Hebrew language. That's why they have to exaggerate to make a superlative or a comparative. There's no language structure for that. And so what happens is, it's like a name. An image is what you call it. They would never say, you could look at that crucifix and say, that is an image, that is a reminder of the crucified Christ. They would say to us, you believe that to be the crucified Christ. There is no distinction because there is no abstraction. If in this world of non-abstract language, the inspired authors of Genesis can say, we are made in the image and the likeness of God. In modern terminology, what they are saying is that there is an essential participation in the divine being as the center and the core of the creation of the human race. Without that active participation relationship in the divine being, we would no longer be human, because that is humanity's distinguishing mark. And so we can say, well, you forgot the other creation story, where man is made out of clay, and so forth. What happens to that piece of clay? The breath of God is blown into it, and it has life. It's a more primitive way of saying the same thing. The imago Dei, the image of the divine, the image of God. That is what defines the human person, which means in the very center, the very core of our being, there is an innate and inherent relationship with God, and if it isn't there, we are no longer human. This is what distinguishes between humanity and the rest of the animal kingdom, is that there is this intentional participation internally between every human person and the divine. If that's true, and Genesis says it is, Revelation says it is, and Revelation is our given, which stands authoritatively beyond us as communicated truth from being from God, then every human person has the capacity, somehow or other, to seek a relationship with its source, its origin. When we take the vast mythologies of the primitive world, and we find within them incredible parallels, and even sometimes greater similarities, we say to ourselves, why is that so? St. Bernard responds to that in a very, very important way. St. Bernard takes this idea of the imago Dei, this participation in the divine, and Bernard places it in our soul, in a faculty of the soul called the will. And so is developed then an explanation from Augustine about us having what they call a tripartite soul. Unless Augustine, being in the 5th century, seems arcane to us, it is also accepted as a foundational principle by both Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. It is, in fact, a grasp and understanding that within the human person, there are primordial functions that differ from one another. And those primordial functions that differ from one another connect to reality in different ways. The most powerful primordial function is the memory. And that's really interesting, because memory, remembering, and anasis is also an essential part of sacramental theology, because we have a scriptural manifestation of the power of remembering. The medievals say that is because in the memory faculty of the human soul, there is a subconscious, preconscious knowledge of our source. And that for that preconscious knowledge of our source, therefore draws us toward a reflection upon what that preconsciousness does to us and tells us. In doing that, then we have a preconscious and unconscious sense that Bernard says is the will remembering something of its origin. This struggle to activate the memory, the unconscious, is what leads humanity to create mythologies which resemble one another, because their source becomes the same. Along with the memory, there is also the will and the intellect, they say. The will, of course, Bernard says, is unaffected by original sin. It is the depository of freedom, and it is the image of the divine within the human person. person. So he says, the reason we choose poorly is because of the intellect, which deceives. And in that deception of the good, the will freely chooses the bad. When we get into that, Scripture itself then tells us, in a very significant sort of way, Scripture tells us that there is, for instance, within the human soul, the capacity to try and overcome its primordial source. And the great scriptural outpouring of that is the story of the fall in the book of Genesis. There is a scholar, Gerhard von Rad, who wrote a book on Genesis. And in that book on Genesis, it says that humanity entered into a struggle at the very beginning with the power of the source of the Creator. And that's the story of the fall. What von Rad does with that story is fascinating. That he shows how humanity falls. Eve is presented with an assertion by the serpent. In fact, as we read it at Mass this morning, is it true that God said you can't eat any of the fruit in the garden? Well, that isn't what God said. Eve engages in a conversation and rises to God's defense. No, he didn't say that. He only said you couldn't eat this fruit. The conversation has begun, and the unraveling of the relationship has begun. It's that way with most temptations. Once the conversation begins, usually the end is determined. The serpent comes back and says to Eve, well, you know why he said that? Well, no, I don't know why he said that. Well, he said that because if you did that, then you'd be like him. And he's very jealous of his power. And von Rad ends up by saying that somehow or other, autonomy becomes more important and power becomes more important than truth and freedom. And humanity chooses then to struggle with its God and to subdue him. That's the story of the fall. And that's the chronic condition of the human society ever since. Preconscious knowledge becomes the inner dynamic of mythology, and it covers up meaning or causes meaning to recede into a darkness. In this darkness, other focuses begin to interpret meaning that can create new narratives and that distort or misunderstand life itself. This is never a real understanding, but it can be believed to be real. And the new meaning is in history, it is conditioned by it, but it is non-historical. It is a myth. So from the very earliest days, whenever humanity, for instance, and this is what the meaning of the story of the fall is, whenever humanity encounters the full power of its source, it strives in some way to wrench itself free or to overcome that force. And when it does so, it creates its own meaning, exactly as Eco said in Foucault's Pendulum. And it begins then to create a meaning that separates itself from being's self-revelation, self-communication. And in so doing, what it does then is it creates alternative realities that are created from within the human consciousness, pushed and motivated by its unconsciousness into a system and a way of life that somehow or other drives and leads humanity in destructive directions. What I hope to do with these talks is explore the mythologies that humanity has created as it struggles to wrench itself free from the divine, and as it struggles to not only overcome God, but to put him out completely. In so doing, it damages its own humanity. And by resisting the inner reality of its humanity, it leads itself into ways of darkness. There's a great article that I came across by Archbishop Javier Martinez Hernandez, who is the Archbishop of Granada in Spain. It was published in Comunio magazine in the winter edition of 2004. And in that he has something. He's talking about liberalism and secular reason, which is one of the mythologies we're going to certainly come to. But he says, this system of belief I consider to be a major danger for the freedom of the church and for the future of the world. In a sense, it is danger that could prove worse than communism, because it masks itself, it remains hidden, and for that reason it does not create resistance. It might well happen that liberalism could succeed where communism has failed, that is, in destroying the church as a real people with a culture and a tradition, and in emptying Christianity from its human substance. Instead of liberalism, we could say, broadly referring to the same phenomenon, the Enlightenment or modernity. He sees this as a tremendous threat in the modern world. And he also, later on, begins to understand and say something about the fact that it is a mythological phenomenon. It is one of humanity's mythologies that they have created in order to give meaning to their life, that is inherently separated from its authenticity, from its authentic source, and therefore becomes a nihilistic phenomenon, a nihilistic system. I also ran across an article, I'd run across it many years ago, published by the University of South California, UCLA, in their Journal of Philosophy, and it was published in March of 1986. And what it is, it's a philosophy, the article is entitled Philosophy Teaching as Intellectual Affirmative Action. The article is defending the creation of mythology as truth in order to liberate humanity from the structures of normalcy. To achieve the goals of a course in critical thinking, then, I believe teachers must consequently conceive of their task as practicing a kind of intellectual affirmative action in advocating minority views rather than conceiving of their task as modeling neutrality. I mean, are we there? Are we getting there? You know, remember that Heather has two minds. This departure from usual pedagogic norms requires theoretical justification, since it will undoubtedly raise fears in some that some sort of indoctrination teachers use to abuse their power in the classroom. Providing this justification is the task I have set myself in this paper. Then he goes on, and he begins to quote, first of all, Herbert Marcuse, who is a kind of the guru of the left, died, I think, in the late 1979, 1980, something like that, taught at Brandeis University, but was very much a dedicated to a one-dimensional concept of materialism. In Marcuse's analysis, in contrast, is specific to advanced capitalist societies. It is these societies made up of indoctrinated individuals who parrot as their own the opinion of their masters, in which breaking the tyranny of public opinion and its makers in a closed society requires awareness that unless the student learns to think in opposite directions, he or she will be inclined to place the facts into the predominant framework of values. The intention is to destroy the values framework of modern society and to replace it with an affirmative action philosophy that redefines, and it goes on with the question is, well, what are these minorities it's supposed to liberate? And they're very restricted. They're only the minorities that the left approve of. And that's women and blacks and the poor. There are no other minorities. And even, he says, even on the far right, if there is a minority, it's only really a reflection of the majority in the last analysis, and should be subjected also to this kind of deconstruction. So that we have then the theory of education as affirmative action, as a way of reconstructing a mythology that empowers those people whom the leftist establishment establishes as oppressed minorities. It is an educational philosophy which has invaded most of our universities. And we see this, and we saw it, I taught at Kenyon College, and that's actually where this man taught. That's how I knew about the article. But it really is an interesting, it's a dangerous thing, but it's an interesting thing. In relationship to this, I can tell you an example. There is, most of the modern progressivism is based on a 19th century German study of Aristotle. He was the enlightened hero of the German philosophers, the contemporary philosophers. Not all of his work, some of mainly the ethics and the politics. But basically, Martha Nussbaum, she's now at, I think, Northwestern Law School. She was at Brown University at the time, wrote a book called The Fragility of Goodness. And in that she makes an argument. She says, if Aristotle was so enlightened that we all follow him, why did he approve of slavery? Her answer was, in conformity with this, well, because the culture he lived in was so oppressive, freedom of thought was not possible. And so he would have had to have been educated in order to understand the oppressiveness of slavery. So what is the solution to the problem of injustice? Education. What is education? It is intellectual affirmative action. It is reconstructing reality in such a way that the goals of the minority, who now are becoming the majority, that those goals are able to be imposed upon the unjust structures of the society of which we have previously been a part. So when we talk then about mythology, we're talking about the constructs of reality of the human mind, of the human spirit. And we're asking ourselves, as we construct those mythologies, is there a given? Is there anything that anchors those in some kind of a primordial truth? The answer is yes. And that is what being tells us about itself. The given, the anchor, is revelation. There's another interesting little book that I would like to recommend, and then I'll take questions. And that is a book called The Dialectics of Secularization. It is a colloquy between Jürgen Habermas and Joseph Ratzinger in 2002 or 2004. I'm not exactly sure which it was. But what happened is that Habermas was one of the great defenders of the secularization of Western culture, one of the great philosophers of it. But he saw something was wrong, wasn't working very well. And he wondered, what would a dialogue with religion be like as far as clarifying this for us? And so he went to the leading Catholic intellectual in Europe at the time, who was Cardinal Ratzinger of the CDF. And they presented papers. And those papers are put together in this book called Dialectics of Secularization. The great thing about it is it's 80 pages long, and not 1,200. So this is an issue which is being discussed, but which has to have foundations and a root. And if we don't understand the human origin and source of the mythological constructs of society and reality, and if we do not ourselves understand that we have been privileged, in a sense, to be heirs to the primeval self-communication of being to humanity, so that we have a foundation and a root, like the Hebrews in Babylon, not necessarily to do battle with modern mythology, but to transform it from within. That was the pastoral wisdom of Gregory the Great. Don't tear their temples down, Christianize them. Work within their cultures to bring them back to the authentic source of their being. It's not like you're dragging someone kicking and screaming into a world that is foreign to them. That's part of the paranoia. Ratzinger calls it the pathology of reason. That where, in fact, we cannot accept the accusation that to bring people into touch with that which is most authentic within the core of their being is not oppressive. To rescue them from Harry Brode and his affirmative action intellectual approach, to rescue them from Martha Nussbaum's fragility of goodness, is not oppressive. It is the quintessential understanding of freedom. Because according to St. Bernard, the freedom of the human person exists in the will and is the image of God. If we bring them back to the authenticity of their center, that is not oppression. The question is, how did Scripture do that? And the answer is, read it and see. Because that's exactly what it did. That's exactly what the first chapter of Genesis did. How do we transform that which the human genius has created into that which is authentically related to the truth of their own being? And that's the challenge that the church has in the modern world as far as the proclamation of the gospel is concerned. It is to go back and read Genesis and see how it's done, and then begin ourselves to become part of the transformation of modern mythology on a basis of the given of being itself. So, that's what I hope to do in the next 2 sessions, and do it in historical components. The mythology of the Reformation up to the 19th century Germans, and then the mythology of modern American secularism. So that's what I hope to do. Do you have, and only you will be able to tell me if I succeed. Do you have any questions, challenges, outrages, and any of those other things that are part of the modern world? You don't have to have any questions. That's perfectly all right. Yes, Ann.
I do have a question, and it's basic, I think. Could you explain, as I understood, you just say Bernard of Clairvaux said that will is not really affected by original sin, right, and that the original sin affects the intellect.
And the desires.
And, okay.
Concupiscence, yeah.
Okay, so, could you elaborate a little bit on that, that the intellect perceives things wrongly? Right,
and that's, what he says is this is an unimpaired free faculty of the soul, but it is dependent on its ancillary support from the other faculties of the human soul. John Paul II says in Fides et Ratio, in paragraph 22, I think, where he says that we understand that reason itself is affected by sin, and therefore it's not totally reliable. It has to be corrected with revelation, it has to be guided by revelation. What happens then, in Bernard's understanding of it, this is what Bernard says. He says the will is the image of God. You cannot you cannot disfigure God's image, because scripturally there's a participation there, there's a link there that is divine. And the Eastern Church talks about that more than we do. But he says it's dependent for its free function on the ancillary faculties of concupiscence and intellect and so forth. These can be deceived and are affected by original sin. And therefore they feed the will improper information so that it freely chooses that which is harmful. That's what he says. You know, it's not exact. You won't find that same thing certainly in Aquinas or many of the other medievals. But for Bernard, this is very critical and very central. And the reason that I brought it up is because it emphasizes this primeval sense of the participation in the divine somehow. How is it, if it is the essence of our human nature, how are we still human if it's totally damaged, which was the Protestant Reformation's error, as far as we are concerned, the total depravity of humanity. Bernard stands up against that concept, because if they were true, according to Genesis, we would then all no longer be human after original sin. So it's a question of understanding the different ways that medieval theology dealt with the different components and parts of the human person. They all agreed that there were ancillary faculties and central realities within the human person. They all agree with that. The question is, how do they work? And for Bernard, this is how it works. That doesn't mean that that is forever doctrinally true, but it means it is a respectable position to hold, even though you might disagree with it and find another explanation to be maybe better suited to the situation. But the will for Bernard is the imago Dei. It is where the image of God resides within the human soul. And since it is the imago Dei, he says, it cannot be damaged by original sin. But since we know that we will bad things, he said, how does that happen? And he talks about concupiscence and intellect and so forth. But the point really is to emphasize that very thing that comes from the creation story in Genesis. Does that help at all, or is that still fuzzy? Okay. Is there anything else? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned how you get this kind of mythologization as like a intellectual affirmative action that is taking place in education. And I can say firsthand, I only had a Catholic education at the university level, but I see this, even there, and just from talking with others and just reading and learning, this sort of thing has infiltrated, like the parochial education system from the ground up. Now, I mean, there are Orthodox Catholic schools, both grade school and college, but what can we do when it has made its way
that's the one thing I don't want to do is say what we can do, because everybody has to decide that for themselves, okay? But my goal is this. If we can strive to understand the phenomenon, then each of us in our own way is challenged to respond to it in the environments in which we live. This idea of showing off, well, if only the bishops would do this, everything would be all right, it's not true. Or if only the priests would do this, it's not true. Each person emerges from this model as an agent of the divine in the midst of the world. And those who have accepted the given of being self-communication are therefore, in a way, responsible for preserving that truth within themselves and enabling others to reach that core, that center. No matter how hard it is, no matter how much people would like, in a way, to be totally and completely independent of any kind of a given, Archbishop Martinez quotes Alistair MacIntyre in here. I'm not finding it immediately and right away, but where he really does actually talk about how this lends itself into nihilism and self-destruction. And I think that that's why, for instance, we were completely wrong to, I can't find it right now, I underlined it, but why we were completely wrong to abandon the whole concept of missionary work within the church. Because we were convinced that it was an imperialistic outreach. And certainly, in some sense, there were that elements in it. There's a very fine dissertation in the Catholic University on the St. James Society and the role that, the CIA and so forth played in the mission work down there. So is it a false accusation? Not completely. Not completely. But is it an encompassing accusation? No. Because at the core of it all lies this. Yes?
What role is the natural law going to play in this? Is that part of Revelation, or?
I think, that becomes something actually Cardinal Ratzinger talks about in this book. But he states it a little bit more lightly than that. And basically, what it actually goes back to is this primordial relationship between each human person and the source of their being. And that is, who is that being that they are related to? The being who they are related to is the creator of all that is. So that they are related, in a sense, through God to everything. And out of that emerges the concept of a natural law. Because there has to be, in the very center and core of all reality, harmony. What holds that harmony together? What is supposed to be able to transcend the mythologies of the world and bring them into some kind of common harmony? And this is really, a lot of people understand the danger of that for them. Remember when, during Clarence Thomas's hearings for the Supreme Court, with all of the nasty stuff that was done to him, he said he believed in natural law, and that created actually the greatest outrage, because what they were afraid of was a tyranny of virtue. If there is a natural order to creation, then there is such a thing as a virtuous way of life. Virtue meaning conforming ourselves to natural law, whose source is the divine. If we are to do that, then our mythologies break, because we're drawn back to a core, to a center. And they will not go there, because they know that that's the end. They know that they lose their whole argument then. If there is such a thing as virtue, and such a thing as a natural, and what we have talked about it in terms of, very honestly, was this kind of primordial connectivity, the imago Dei, the image of God, the image of the divine in the human person. If, in fact, that is true, then their mythologies are groundless and without foundation, and are standing in need of inner transformation based on the fact that who they are, actually, really, even as an existent human person.
So this would then be true by extension of modern empirical science itself, in the sense that
I think that
modern science
is moving toward conformity with this. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the demise of the mechanistic view of reality, which was Newtonian physics and so forth, and Descartes and all of that. But basically, quantum physics seems to be moving more toward this idea of the reality beyond, that is the source of what is. And it's doing so in amazing ways, in ways I'm not a physicist, and so if I read the formulae, I'm not sure what they say, but if I read the narrative, I can grasp it, you know? And so what they are saying, and especially a quantum physicist named David Bohm, who has written a book called The Implicate Order, where he says the whole thing is like a hologram. Every particle reflects the source of the whole, and so forth. It's a fascinating theory. But what's happening is that quantum physics is beginning to. I have a friend, Father John Yutz Bamberger, who was the abbot of the Genesee for many years. He said, you know, physics is the only interesting intellectual field left in the modern world. So it made me feel terribly inadequate when he said that. But there is, once you investigate it, there is this kind of convergence that we begin to see. St. Bonaventure called the cosmos the consciousness of God. Well, as quantum physics moves more and more into this understanding of an integral, intelligent cosmos, that seems to be emerging as a greater probability within the field of modern thought and modern reflection. The thing of it is, those people locked into the mythologies that they have derived from their own unconscious and have decided they are God, are incapable intellectually of moving into any other kind of sphere of understanding. And that becomes very difficult. I have a friend, in fact, at Kenyon. He called me almost every night, 5 nights a week at 8:30, and talked for an hour and a half about what he had written that day. And he wrote on 19th century German philosophy, which I appreciated his vocals because I learned a lot. But he was a man who went all the way through the PhD in Catholic schools, his first doctorate, and then onto the New School. But he, of course, was an atheist and a Marxist and all those kinds of things. And the idea of touching into the core, he was protected because he knew he was vulnerable. He was smart enough to know he was vulnerable, but he knew how to protect himself also. Now, what will become of him in this long journey of life, I don't know. But that's the thing, that's why to confront is to, and I'm not saying politically you can't do, I'm not saying anything like that, but individually to confront is to erect outside of a relationship of deep friendship, is to create a defensive shield that is impenetrable. It's like, you know, anyone else. If your treasure is attacked, you'll protect it. That's why what's so interesting about the first chapter of Genesis. It doesn't say, oh, that's all hogwash. It just takes it like this and opens it up like a flower blooming into something different than it was before. And yet it was the product of the human unconscious, situated in history, grappling for meaning. And these are the things that we deal with. Ron?
I don't know how much you'll answer this tonight, because they might anticipate the third one, but you emphasize this link with divine, that our myths, they have this common knowledge from this link with divine. What happens to that link with the divine when we deny God? Or do we put something in its place?
What happens is we suppress the core, and we use the unconscious to create alternative realities. That's what modern mythology is. They are the unconscious creating alternative realities which rise into consciousness and become causes. And so it is, whether it's in our own society or whether it's historically to be found in other societies, I mean, there it is. The same phenomenon reoccurs over and over again. So the challenge, basically, of ourselves as you know, the people of the church, the challenges never go away. We never reach the point where finally, you know, here we are. We can rest in peace. It's not going to happen. Yes.
So, Monsignor, I think we're talking all about it, but so how would you say then that an unbeliever, what do they call the given? What's an unbeliever called?
I think each unbeliever calls the given something of their own choosing. Is it the discipleship of, for instance, we have politicians, Hillary Clinton is one who was a disciple of Herbert Marcuse, that his idea is therefore the given. That's what they operate from. They operate out of accepting mythological reality. It's totally the other way around. But they have no given.
What does Habermas say?
It's interesting to read what he says. He goes round and round and round about how human society, reflecting upon itself, will understand this, that, and the other thing. So what is the given human society? What is human society? He doesn't define it. He just gives it a task to perform. Then he says it's not performing it. So what do we do? So let's have a conversation with religion, where all of his peers ostracized him for talking to religion. And Ratzinger is very careful in his response, very, very brilliant in his response. It's interesting. But there is no given.